special city commission meeting to order. We have the clerk call a roll.
Mayor Jennings.
Here.
Commissioner Angel.
Here.
Commissioner Crawford.
Here.
Commissioner Householder.
Here.
Commissioner Shirley.
Today we have one matter before us. Mr. Bingston.
Thank you, Mayor, Commissioners. You do have before you the ordinance that would approve entering into a master tax-exempt lease purchase agreement. This relates to the proposed HVAC project for the city-county building. Related to that, you also have before you a document, a co-lessee payment and contribution agreement that further refines and defines the relationship between the city and the county as you would both be expected to undertake this lease purchase arrangement. Related to that were some fine-tuning, if you will, of the interlocal agreement between the city and county as to allocation of space and budgeting and appropriation of payment for expenses over time in terms of operation of the building. This, of course, begins with the HVAC project itself. Attached to your blue sheet there was the blue sheet and the resolution of intent that the Commission adopted earlier this year, when at that point in time it was understood that the long-term lease purchase agreement could be entered into by the building authority. Over time, it was determined by the financing source that instead needed to be with the city and with the county. And that would make sense in that those are the two entities with taxing authority and the ability to, and are the source of funding for the payment over time. So this process has been necessary in order to appropriately position the city and the county relative to this 15-year lease purchase agreement. I suppose I should ask if anyone has questions about the project before we go on into these matters related to the financing, whether that be Jim Schroeder or Jason, probably being, I'm sure, being a better source of information as on the project. Just wanted to be sure that we addressed any of those questions you might have, and then we can certainly move to the financing aspect.
Any project-related questions?
Okay. The stack of documents that I literally just put at your place and is a series of versions of the lease purchase arrangement. And I would like to take a moment and would also like to call on Aaron Martin, who assisted me. We literally had changes to those documents occurring at around noon. We were still negotiating some of those terms. And there is one aspect in particular as it relates to both the long-term lease purchase agreement and the agreement between the city and county as to the contribution and the payment arrangement. The basics are that under the lease purchase agreement, we are jointly and severally liable, both the city and county, for that full $2,750,000 as far as that documentation is concerned. And from the lender's standpoint, that was to be expected. It was then a matter of the agreement between the city and county to allocate the 40% share to the city, the 60% share to the county based upon occupancy, and so that both parties would be in the position in the remote, unanticipated circumstance that either party would not appropriate the funds in any given year, that the other would be in a position to do so to cure that failure to pay so as not to jeopardize the status of the HVAC system in the building, and then have a cause of action against the other to recover any of those amounts paid on behalf of the other. Well, we obviously recognize how remote that is, but the types of things that need to be put in place to protect both parties' interests in entering into this sort of arrangement. And that's where we were. There was the aspect that came up literally at noon today as we were dealing with these other matters. Aaron was helpful in negotiating what I think was necessary for the city's position, and I do think it warrants some quick explanation if we can take a moment on that.
And to further explain the last-minute negotiations with U.S. Bank, this morning U.S. Bank forwarded a final draft of the lease purchase agreement, making certain changes to the insurance requirements that we had requested. And with that change, they also added a new provision under Section 14.11, which is contained in the addendum to the lease purchase agreement. Among other things, the new Section 14.11 expanded upon the joint and several liability concept between the city and the county, but the problematic provision that we found was the addition of a sentence that provided that the non-appropriation by either party will constitute the non-appropriation of both parties, which, again, in the remote and unanticipated circumstance of either party's non-appropriation, we do want to have the right to cure and step in and fulfill the financial obligations under the lease on behalf of the county in the event that they were to not pay or not appropriate. So the last-minute change we made was to delete the sentence that created a non-appropriation by one party to be the non-appropriation of both parties. And that now is consistent with the contribution agreement that we have, so that if either party does not pay, the other party has the right to step in and make full payment of the monthly lease obligations, so that the relationship with U.S. Bank can hopefully continue over the course of the lease term.
And with that, I know we need to keep moving. I think we just ask if there are any questions about the lease purchase component and the co-lessee payment and contribution agreement that further defines the relationship between the city and the county.
None here.
I don't believe so.
As compelling as all of this is. That takes us then to the proposed amendment to the current interlocal cooperation agreement. We are addressing there, in the first instance, amendment of what is presently paragraph 8 of that restatement of agreement. There we are addressing the matter of the scenario if there were to be a, well, that paragraph addresses the situation if either the city or the county wish to request additional space, and there's no change in that language. The changes all relate to the potential scenario where either the city or the county would be requesting a decrease in their current allocation of space. The reason that became significant in looking at the agreement, particularly in the context of the undertaking of this significant investment, it was clear that just on an ongoing basis, if one of the parties chose to decrease its space, and under the current arrangement, that space would then become potentially declared by the building authority as available for sublease through the building authority. it had the potential effect that by no action on the other party's part, say for instance if the city had elected to decrease its space, and that then was made available for sublease, but for whatever reason was not subleased, you had the potential in that scenario that the county's share, by virtue of no action of their own, would increase in terms of their percentage of occupied space and, as a result, their share of the expenses, and vice versa. What we have done here is attempted to put in place a system whereby each would have their currently allocated percentage that is based on occupancy. That's the 40-60 presently. And to say that if there was a request to decrease space, then that party, either the city or county, could go to the board of directors, make that point, and get a determination that that space would be available for subleasing, but it would still be the responsibility of that party to conduct that subleasing under the conditions that are outlined, and that party would still remain responsible for the expenses associated with that space. Now, if I may get down in the weeds here a little more, even in terms of some of the detail, this does present a situation where sometimes anticipating all the scenarios can get fairly complex, but it's an attempt to anticipate as well as possible those potential scenarios. That would come, if you look at the red line version there that I believe each of you have at your place. If you look at what is subparagraph D, well, I'm sorry, C at the top of page 3, we do make clear that, if I may, I'll just use the city as an example. If the city's had a decrease in space, the city has subleased any of that space, the city retains the right at any point in time to resume its own occupancy of that space, terminating the sublease presumably and just resuming that right. Simple enough. D addresses the situation we were concerned about. Obviously, the two primary occupants of this structure are the building of the city and the county, and to protect both parties' interests, the thought was that if one party enters into this subleasing scenario, and even though the other might not have an immediate need for that space, that we didn't want to get locked into a long-term situation where either the city or the county might have a need for the space, but couldn't grow into that space because it was sublet by the other. So this sets up the scenario whereby, of course, there's the initial opportunity to, if one party says they would like to decrease, the other can immediately assume that space. If we get into the sublease scenario, it is possible for the other party to later, well, we've identified them as the responding party, to later determine that they do have a need. And we've set up the subleasing so that it's on a relatively short term and no more than 1 year on the initial term and terminable upon 6 months' notice, so that in that time frame, if the party that either the city or county needed the additional space, they could notice the other and indicate that they would like to assume occupancy of that space. That would then trigger the necessity on the part of either the city or the county, whomever was subletting, to terminate that sublease arrangement and prepare to deliver possession or occupancy to the other party who had the need within, well, it's a 60-day notice time frame, and then in 60 days to deliver possession. There's also the aspect that, given where we are starting at present in terms of the allocation between the two, a request that was made of the county or by the county, and Jason may wish to speak to the policy aspects of it, and that is somewhat different than any of our previous discussions about this, would be that if we're in that scenario where the party who didn't need the space at first, but determines later that they would like to have the space, they give notice of that. We have provided for the opportunity for, whether it be the city or the county that had entered into that sublease scenario, that if they believe upon receiving notice from the other that the other would like to have the space, if they believe that they have a need for the space, we're back to that situation where it seemed like we should then, instead of one necessarily trumping the other just as a matter of default, that at that point in time, you're back to the board of directors with the same scenario that you would if someone were requesting additional space, where the board would make a determination based on the merits of the need as to who should end up with that space.
The Board of the Building Authority,
Yes,
which has 3 county commissioners and 2 city commissioners.
there is that aspect, yes.
Yeah, Commissioners.
That
when
one
we-
we're not trying to fix today.
When we looked at it, we said, okay, there are really 3 parties involved. There's the original tenant, which could be either city or county. There's the other party, which would be either the city or the county, and there's the subtenant. And the thought being is that, let's say it's the city's space, and we at some point say we want to reduce the amount of space. County says we're not interested in it today, so we go out and find a subtenant. And then later, the county says we are interested in the space, rather than saying, oh, let's say in this case, the county automatically has that opportunity to take the space away from the city, because we may now have an interest, we may not, but we may. The thought being is that it kind of goes into a little bit more of a neutral process going back to the board, and they can determine the best use of the building.
I don't know how she did.
Yeah, the only other way would say you get to reserve it as your space until you relinquish it altogether and take it away from the board. But I think that's a pretty good, even way to look at it, because really the key of this is to, the biggest key of this is for neither party to be harmed in a way to where they're given more space and have to pay more equivalent. That's really what all this is about. So this is sort of a reverse issue. That's sort of a secondary issue, and it seems like a pretty fair way of handling it. That's the way we were looking at it.
Let's just not get in that spot. Then we won't have to worry
Yeah.
about it.
Yeah, I hope
Seems like
it's
if this
as,
and this and if this and
I think we all hope it is as remote as it sounds. And I wish there were a simpler way to deal with it, but that's what, in working on it with, in discussions with city and county, that was what was arrived at as possibly the best way to address it. The other aspect of the interlocal agreement, at the time that this restatement was done, it was at the time that US 2305 was moving from the building, and it was left, as you know, sometimes agreements address just what's going to happen if everything goes okay, but doesn't necessarily anticipate sometimes what could possibly go wrong. And again, we hope this is all quite remote, but the amendments to paragraph 9 try to address a little more specific, well, quite a bit more specifically, if we would have that remote circumstance again, as we talked about on the lease purchase, where if you had a non-appropriation or a party that just had a problem and was not stepping up, so to speak, in terms of that jointly agreed upon budget, and if it were just absolutely necessary to keep the building in operation for that to go forward, there again is this opportunity to go forward and to take care of whatever those expenses might be, and frankly to recover against the other if that ever became necessary. But it just attempts to address, in much the same model as we did with the co-lessee agreement, what would happen in, again, that very unlikely, if not simply won't happen scenario. But it does kind of close that loop, hopefully better than the agreement did before in that unlikely scenario. Of course, we've been working in tandem with the county, and a lot of this has to do with, obviously, we want to get this done. But there is the aspect that relates to all of this documentation as well as the timing. As you may have noted, there is a request that the ordinance approving the lease purchase agreement be considered on both first and second reading today. Mr. Schroeder can speak better to the details, but I believe largely through his efforts, we have been able to preserve that pricing aspect that has been the point of trying to come to closure on the issuance of the debt. And we do have assurances today that if we're able to go forward on the time frame that we're anticipating, which is a closing on Friday, with a special meeting of the county commission either later today or tomorrow, depending on how their schedules work out, that we should be able to, if this all meets your approval, should be able to achieve that closing date and achieve the approximately $60,000 cost savings. You might want to speak to that, Jim, a little more specifically.
Yes, the price had actually gone up a couple times through the Mitsubishi product for what that amounts to. And it's a 6% price increase at this time that's in place. In fact, there's some more than that. But they were going to raise it for us. The 6% was $60,000+, 69 maybe. I should have brought that paper with me. But we are guaranteed that through today and tomorrow with substantial documentation that we are making some way. You know, we actually opened these bids in June, okayed the process in July, so they've been pretty tolerant of our difficulties in the who we are and how complicated it is to work the city's and the county's interest in a line with the building authority. So we hope to get both approvals today so we can do the same thing then with the county later today, tomorrow, if not.
Very good.
Any more questions?
Nope. Thank you.
I might mention in closing that this is a secured form of debt, and of course, as a result, we have had the benefit of the assistance of bond counsel on behalf of both the city and county. Sarah Steele and the Wichita office of Gilmore and Bell has taken care of those responsibilities, so we're not on an unsupervised basis.
Okay. So then for action on this issue, there's a resolution and an ordinance, and the resolution comes to us with either the ability to approve that resolution or not, and then the ordinance to approve on first reading, then declare an emergency for the existence of a second reading, and then to approve on second reading, or to not approve the ordinance. So those are the definition of our actions.
That's correct. And the only quick point of clarification I might make, Mayor, is that as we have transitioned with that recent state law change, the finding is actually of a compelling public interest in terms of the justification of the second reading.
Any questions of anybody on commission or any further discussion desired? If not, then I'd entertain motions for action.
Mayor, I move we approve resolution number 126962, authorizing the mayor to execute the co-lessee payment and contribution agreement and the First Amendment to restatement of the Salina Interlocal Cooperation Agreement.
Second.
We have a motion and a second to approve this resolution number 12-6962. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Those opposed? That motion carries 4-0.
Mayor, I move that we adopt ordinance 12-10669 on first reading.
Second.
We have a motion and a second to approve ordinance number 12-10669 on first reading. All those in favor?
Aye.
Those opposed? That motion carries 4-0.
Mayor, I move that the commission determine that a compelling public purpose exists, which would be the ability to take advantage of a cost savings of over $60,000 by making a decision and adopting the ordinance this week and moving forward with second reading today.
Second.
So we have a motion and a second for second reading approval of this today due to compelling public interest. So all those in favor of approving ordinance number 12, no, we're going to go to the clerk reading the roll for approval on second reading of ordinance number 12-10. 669. Approve the motion for the compelling.
Yeah, that would just take,
Move into
that would just take a majority vote, and then
Okay.
when we move to
So-
second reading.
So all those desiring to move into a second reading for compelling public purpose, say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? That motion carries 4-0.
There you go.
Mayor, I move we adopt ordinance 12-10669 on second reading.
Second.
Motion and a second to approve ordinance number 12-10669 on second reading. Would the clerk please call the roll?
Commissioner Angel?
Aye.
Commissioner Crawford?
Aye.
Commissioner Householder?
Aye.
Mayor Jennings?
Aye. That motion carries 4-0. Do we have any other business in front of us today?
Don't believe so. Thank you all very much for being here today.
Thank you.
It was very helpful.
Move to adjourn?
Second.
Motion and a second to adjourn. All those in favor?
Aye.
Those opposed? That carries 4-0. We are adjourned.